The church at St. Augustine smelled of lavender and wax. The candles guttered like quiet witnesses to a village that had learned how to whisper to God together. Mary knelt by the pulpit with her fingers folded around the coarse cord of the kneeler, and the hush in the room felt like a held breath. Outside, fog lay low over the cobbles and the roofs, and a single lamp on the green threw a halo that trembled when the wind came through the plane trees. Mary had come to pray for James. James with the hollowed cheeks, the nervous laugh that came too fast, the nights she had heard him stumble home, and the mornings she had found him weeping in a doorway. She had come to ask for a remedy she could not make with her hands. As she prayed, something like a warmth moved through the chapel. Not heat exactly, but a clarity, a fine brightness that lit the grains of wood on the pews and made the dust in the air look like stars. Mary did not think of words at first, she only listened. In that listening, a thought took shape, startlingly simple and strange. People are bound together in ways we cannot see. She imagined threads tying neighbor to neighbor, heart to heart, a web of small mercies and unanswered pleas. She thought, with a curious flicker of daring, of a word she had heard in passing from a young scientist who came to the village once to sort out his grief: quantum entanglement. She did not understand the physics behind the word. She knew only that it named a mystery, the way two things, once touched, kept answering each other even when apart. The phrase felt like a key for language, the bridge between what the elders called the communion of saints and what the young were hearing in their classrooms and podcasts. Mary tucked that word into her prayer, not as proof, but as a picture. If you are watching, if this story finds you and your heart is heavy, subscribe and like to join this small circle of witness. There are more to come. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next evenings we gather to listen for light. After that one-sentence invitation, mere courtesy to the new rhythms of a younger congregation, Mary rose and slipped into the village dusk. James's cottage sat at the bend where the lane met the river. Smoke from a peat fire drifted thinly through the choke of fog. She hesitated on the threshold, smelling the peat and damp wool, hearing through the thin walls low sounds of restlessness. Inside, James lay curled in a chair, a blanket tucked about his knees though the night was not cold. When he saw her, he turned, small and furious at being seen, then meek as a child when he asked for silence. Mary sat a careful distance away and, after some minutes of quiet, reached out to lay a hand over his. "You don't have to bear it alone," she said. Her voice was small enough not to startle. James blinked. He had words like stones in his mouth, some bright and jagged, some swallowed whole. "Do prayers change anything?" he asked.
The question was blunt and not rhetorical. It carried the fatigue of a man who had asked that same question to cheaper lights and harder hands, and had been answered with promises that shrank into the next morning. "There is no guarantee," Mary answered honestly, which was the only way she knew to speak. "But there is a bond. We answer each other. We are tied. Sometimes it is the answer itself that changes us." That night, James dreamed of a child standing beneath a tree whose leaves glowed like lanterns. The child, Ara, pointed to one leaf and plucked it, handing it to him. When he woke, his palm felt slightly damp, as if from dew, though there had been no dew in his room. He rolled the imagined leaf between his fingers for a long time, as the fog lifted and the first light fretted along the horizon. Word traveled slowly, and then with the speed of a rumor that felt like hope. It began with Clara. Clara was old in the way that oak is old, rings upon rings of years. But she carried in her the kind of laughter that shook dust from the corners of the church. For months she had kept to her chair. Arthritis had braided her hands and bent her shoulders. In the evening, after Mary's prayer watch, Miriam brought a pot of broth and a handful of rosemary, because one must bring both body and smell. Clara was counting the hours when the lights dimmed in the lane, and the fog rolled through like a slow ocean. She closed her eyes, and in the close space of her chest she heard the small music of breath. In the dark she felt something move, a pressure like a prayer pressed to her heart. She opened her hands and, astonished, found them less stiff. The next morning she rose and reached for the latch of her garden gate, and her fingers, for the first time in years, slipped easily into the cold iron. She went to the window and looked out at the plane tree on the green. For a moment she thought she saw a faint silver gleam through its branches, as if each leaf had kept a memory of light. She walked to the door and went out barefoot into the dew. Clara's report was not dramatic, in the way newspapers imagine miracles. She did not shout from the pulpit. She carried her changed hands to the kneeler and only said, "I can put on a glove." People who had known her for decades began to believe anew. For Mary, Clara's small word was the hinge on which the village turned. It was Miriam who put the hinge to use. Miriam kept a garden courtyard behind her little cottage, a stretch of soil that had been the village's cupboard in wartime and its quiet refuge in winter. She proposed a project with the no-nonsense tenderness of a woman who had raised children and things that needed tending. "We will plant together," she told Mary and Thomas and anyone who would listen. "We will repair what's bent and feed it and see what comes up." Miriam's idea found its place in the village's beating heart.
They would call the mission the Gathering of Hope and set a meeting in the field behind the ruined mill. The gathering would be practical, soup and mending and a place to sleep for those without roofs. And it would be spiritual, prayers, testimonies, and a simple sign. Mary suggested a tree. Not a huge oak or a planted forest, but one young sapling that they would plant together, every person wrapping some intention, quiet or loud, into the soil when they set it in the ground. The symbol was plain: life put down deep, roots set against the erosion. Thomas, the elder who had sat on the council for years, watched the plans with a folded face. Skepticism made him careful. He had seen movements bend into folly and had felt the damage of promises that had no footing. He feared superstition and the easy slide from faith to spectacle. "We cannot make faith be what it is not," he said once in the vestry, hands on his cane. "If we are to do this, we must do it without theater." Mary thanked him for his caution. "We will not make miracles into performance," she promised. "We will make room for prayer and care. We will be faithful in small things." James, meanwhile, shifted through nights as if through a stormed room, grasping at furniture and memories. There were days he stayed away from gatherings because shame sat heavy on his chest. There were other days when he came and stayed at the back, a silhouette in the doorway, watching as people folded blankets and ladled broth into chipped bowls. When he let himself, slowly, listen, the testimonies pried open a seam in his heart. The sound of a child saying "thank you for soup" was a plea and an offering all at once. The gathering of hope took place under a sky that could not decide between rain and clearing light. The field smelled like wet earth and old hay. The sapling sat in a hollow by the ruined mill, its roots wrapped in burlap. People came with spoons and scars and stories. Ara, the child whose name means messenger, came barefoot and with hair full of hay. Ara walked straight to the sapling, placed both small palms in the soil, and whispered, "This tree will know us." When asked what she meant, Ara only smiled, as if revealing a secret too big for words. Mary stood up to speak as the lanterns were lit. She had chosen a title for her brief address that felt like a bridge between the language of their grandmothers and the curious phrases she had heard in passing. Unravel Quantum Entanglement, 7 Miraculous Truths Backed by Faith. The title startled some and amused others, but Mary's intent was sober.
She wanted to name the invisible ties that had begun to show themselves in Clara's hands, in James's small returns, in neighbors arriving with bread. She did not mean to borrow the word as proof of God, but as a metaphor, an attempt to pluck a contemporary symbol from the air and use it to point hearts back to the ancient truth. We are not islands.
One by one, without pomp and with more humility than flamboyance, Mary spoke the 7 truths. Each truth she spoke felt small but true, and each was accompanied by an instance that made it flesh. The first truth: presence precedes answer. Mary recalled the candlelit Wednesday when she had knelt and felt a brightness in the chapel. That presence had not come as a decree, but as a patient company. It did not mean God would erase pain, it meant God would not abandon them to it. The second truth: small acts are holy vectors. Miriam's soup, the mending of a coat, Clara's hand reaching for a gate, these small things were not trivial. They were ways of being tangled together, showing affection in action. People murmured, thinking of their own small mercies. The third truth: children name what grown eyes cannot. Ara's simple words, "This tree will know us," were not a prophecy in the theatrical sense, but a piercing recognition. Children, Mary said, are porous to the holy in ways adults lose when they arm themselves with disbelief. The fourth truth: signs do not demand belief, they invite it. The silver gleam in the plane tree's branches was not a test. It was an invitation to lean in and try faith on for a night. Thomas nodded grimly. No miracle could be coerced, but one could respond. The fifth truth: healing is often incremental. Clara's hands did not become young again in a moment. They unfolded slowly, like spring. James's recovery would too be measured in small victories. Mornings he did not drink. Afternoons he showed up. Confessions that were whispered instead of swallowed. The sixth truth: the Holy Spirit breathes in common rooms. Mary had felt that breath in the chapel, felt it in the breath of those who gathered at night. It was not a private possession for the pious, but a communal pulse that made breath into song. The seventh truth: commitment shapes destiny more than spectacle. Planting a tree did not guarantee a forest, nor did an evening of fervor secure a lifetime of faith. What mattered was the steady tending, the willingness to keep coming back and to lay down hands and time. As Mary spoke, the fog lifted enough to trace lights on the edges of the field. Someone had nailed a small piece of silver onto the sapling, a token they had found, a spoon, a ring, a rusted key, gifts that anchored the tree in the village's private histories. They piled hands into the hole, each pressing earth over roots, each pressing a hope into the dark. Thomas surprised Mary by staying. He did not say much, but when it was his turn, he murmured a confession about times he had failed to speak when he could have. His voice carried with an honesty that frightened his old reserve into grace. That evening, a hush took the village like a hand laid over it, a hush that was not silence, but attention. James edged up to the sapling with Mary's encouragement.
His bones were thin and his face too knotted with things he could not name, but he knelt and brushed soil onto the burlap. He pressed his forehead to the young bark and felt, in that briefness, a softness that was not made of flesh, a sense of belonging. It was not a cure, and Mary would not say it was. It was a tether. Afterward, he went to the long bench by the mill and rested his head on his hands and let out a long breath that sounded suspiciously like relief. The days after the gathering were not a tidy sequence of miracles, and that was the point. Some mornings James walked the lane sober. Other mornings, the village found him asleep by the river, cold and ashamed. Clara continued to stitch mittens and to lift the kettle. Each morning she felt for the old stiffness and measured herself against the small gains. Miriam cleared the courtyard and taught a few women to prune the gnarled roses from which they would cut sprigs for the sick.
Thomas mended a fence he had ignored for years. Mary visited and listened and prayed in ways that were more like sitting beside someone than ordering events from a height. And yet, even in the ordinary grind, there were fingerprints of the 7 truths. A neighbor brought bread to a family who had lost wages. A young mother, exhausted, found in the prayer circle a hand that would carry her sleeping child while she washed her hair. Ara, who had been quiet after the gathering, began to show up early to church and stand by the little sapling, running a finger along the silver token as if she were reading a map. There were nights when the fog rolled back over St. Augustine as if to test the light. Once, in such a night, Mary woke to a sound like distant singing. She dressed in layers and slipped into the lane where mist thickened the air. There, by the plane tree on the green, a group had gathered. People with blankets, cups of tea steaming in the chill, faces upturned. Clara leaned on Thomas's arm. James sat with his shoulders squared in a new posture of listening. They sang in soft, uncertain harmonies, voices that did not need to be perfect because they were together. The mist around them looked for a moment like smoke from a hearth, warm and preserving. Mary felt the breath she had once described, the Holy Spirit, she named it silently, and it moved through them with the tenderness of a hand smoothing hair. Not everyone was convinced. A few left in the early weeks, saying the fervor felt contagious in a bad way. Some called the movement naive. There were practical arguments too. How would the gathering be funded? Who would manage the shelter? Thomas argued for sober accounting. Miriam argued for hospitality without too many rules. These questions mattered. Faith without practicality can become arrogance, as much as practicality without faith can become cruelty. One evening, a visitor arrived, dust on his shoes and eyes tired from cities. He introduced himself as Elias, a former engineer who had turned to nursing after his brother's death. He brought no fanfare, but he had an odd energy, partly the work of someone used to mending machinery, and partly someone who had seen the deep places of grief and wanted order in their wake. He listened to the story of Clara and James, to the planting, and to the debates about roofs and funds. When Mary told him the name she had given the address, Unravel Quantum Entanglement, Elias smiled in a way that was not a scoff. "I like the phrase," he said, "not because it proves anything, but because it makes people think of connection in a new language. We'll need language the young trust, and the old can translate. That's a gift." Elias stayed a week and then another, helping with simple repairs and learning how to mend broken things that were not only made of wood and fabric. He taught a young man in the village how to patch leaking roofs, and in return, the young man taught Elias how to bake bread in a communal oven. They traded skills like prayers. The miracle story that would become the hinge for the wider region did not happen as a thunderclap. It came as a convergence. There was a long season of small acts. Hot broth given to a shivering man who later told them his life had pivoted because someone had bothered to boil water for him. A night spent watching over a woman with fever until she fell into steady sleep. The planting of the sapling that grew a leaf with a small silver vein running through it that looked for a day like it had caught light from the moon and kept it. News, as it does, moved from neighbor to neighbor until someone from the next town heard and asked to come listen. When visitors came, Mary and the others found new urgency in telling the 7 truths, not as platitudes, but as witness. They shared testimonies not to persuade skeptics with spectacle, but to invite them to witness small holiness. They encouraged others to start their own gatherings, to plant their own trees, to tend their own courtyards with the humility of people who knew how slow growth could be. James's arc did not become a tidy tale of redemption overnight. There were relapses and apologies, nights when he would knock on doors and beg for forgiveness he felt unworthy to receive. But the village, learning from the 7 truths, discovered a steadiness that could bear relapse without annihilation. They offered rehab resources where possible, found a mentor from a neighboring town, and, most importantly, continued to place themselves in James's life without smothering him. When he finally found a rhythm that held, work at the bakehouse, and evenings in the prayer circle, he stood before the sapling one autumn and smoothed his palm over its bark with a reverence that was not triumphal, but grateful. Clara continued to mend mittens, and sometimes she would laugh at a joke that slipped out of someone's mouth, and the sound would roll like a small blessing over everyone. Miriam's courtyard became a place where people learned to prune and to plant and to make soup that tasted like mercy. Thomas, who had held suspicion as a shield, began to sit on the bench by the mill and carve small wooden toys for the children, gifts that said without words that his heart had shifted. It was in a season of clearing mist and brightening days that the village observed an image they would carry with them. The sapling, now a small tree with leaves green and strong, had at its base the small silver tokens that neighbors had contributed. In the early morning light, the tokens caught like fish scales. In the afternoon, they were dull and ordinary. The point was not the tokens, but the fact that people had given something of themselves, and that their gifts had stayed. The tree did not become a miracle because of the silver. It became a mirror of a village's willingness to be bound. Mary kept a small notebook where she wrote down the 7 truths and the little stories that made them shine. She used the phrase quantum entanglement always as a metaphorical hinge. Not to say the phenomena of physics proved prayer, but to offer a vocabulary for people who otherwise lived in separate silos to imagine unseen connections. Her language carried risks. Some ridiculed the cocktail of science words and prayers, but it opened doors. Young people who might have been turned off by archaic language found a way in. Elders found in the phrase a new parable to translate to their lived experience. One night, months after the tree had been planted, the village was woken by a sound like the world inhaling. Mary stood on her threshold and saw friends and neighbors on the green, lanterns in their hands. The sapling's leaves trembled, though there was no wind. A pale fog rolled in, thin and luminous, and for a moment it seemed as if the plane tree and the young sapling were in dialogue, leaves answering leaves. Ara, perched near the trunk, stood and sang a short song learned from her grandmother, a melody with words that named the small things: bread, hands, soil, breath. It was not a spectacle orchestrated for visitors. It was a natural exhale of a community that had come through winters and found some threads. Thomas, who had been the most cautious, felt his chest loosen. "I don't think I can call it anything other than God," he murmured to Mary. "I fought the word because it scares me. But when I see how people change, how they keep at it, perhaps that's grace." Mary took his hand in the lamplight and felt the roughness and warmth. She did not claim she could explain the phenomena they had witnessed. She had never been so arrogant. She only held to the 7 truths like a map, not a guarantee. The map showed the way through practice, presence, small acts, childlike seeing, invitation rather than demand, incremental healing, the Holy Spirit in communal breath, and steady commitment. The phrase that had opened the conversation, quantum entanglement, stayed with them as an emblem, sometimes misstated, sometimes mocked, sometimes cherished. It mattered less than the life they built with it. In time, a small network of villages began to meet, each bringing their own saplings and their own small silver tokens, their own versions of the 7 truths. They traded bread recipes and lists of practical donors, and the names of specialists who could help with addiction and shelter. They traded their testimonies like seeds, not as currency, but as possibility. Mary knew the work would not end. She knew that suffering returned to some, and new forms of sorrow would come. She also knew that the truth she had felt in the chapel, presence that precedes answer, was not a strategy but a posture. To live that posture meant tending not only trees but people, making room for slips and for steady returns, avoiding the twin dangers of spectacle and cynicism. Late one evening, as Mary walked the lane alone, the cold pressing at her cheeks, she thought of the first glow she had felt in the pulpit. She had been frightened at the thought of naming it, and then emboldened by the image of threads. She smiled at the memory of borrowing a scientific phrase as a bridge. Words, she had learned, were tools. Used with humility, they could open hearts to silence, and from that silence to companionship. She paused at James's cottage and heard the soft respiration of sleep. In the window light, a small hand moved, James turning in calm repose. Mary stood a long time and prayed as she had always done, not for guarantees, but for presence. "Lord," she whispered, "make us faithful in tending. Teach us to be entangled with mercy." The village kept tending. People came and left. The gathering of hope stitched new people into old fabric. Children grew, and the sapling grew. There would be other seasons of fog. There would be other seasons of light. The 7 truths were not a list to be recited as liturgy, but a daily practice, a grammar of belonging, that made the ordinary days bear witness to something larger. And at the center of it all was a simple observation Mary repeated often to anyone who asked. The world is woven. We can choose to be threads that fray alone, or threads that knot together. In the knots, small, stubborn, and unshowy, life took root. The night the visitors from the next town came, they found not grand miracles, but a village where people came when asked, where neighbors carried one another's grief like a common garment, where a child's voice could start a revolution of tenderness. They listened to Mary speak the 7 truths not as doctrine but as testimony. They watched James stand and pour bread into a bowl that was handed to a man who had just crossed the lane. They watched Clara tie on a mitten and hand it to a child with a crooked grin. They saw the sapling glinting with its little tokens and the plane tree bending low as if to shelter it. When they left, a few women stayed to learn how to prune roses and how to make broth that warmed both body and will. They took with them stories and names and the phrase that had brought them in, and they carried it into neighborhoods that had stopped asking for neighbors entirely and had learned instead to live on transactions. If there was a miraculous truth that held most stubbornly, Mary thought later as she sat by the sapling under a sky freckled with stars, it was not the way leaves glimmered, nor the unexpected ease of an old wrist. It was this, that when people are willing to keep showing up, to tend small fires, to make room for shame and for confession, to resist both spectacle and cynicism, then a slow architecture of grace emerges. Whether you call that entanglement or communion or simply mercy, it asked for one thing above all, presence. She pressed a thumb into the bark of the young tree and felt the faint give of life beneath her skin. Somewhere in the village a kettle hissed, a baby began to cry, a phone buzzed in a visitor's pocket, indistinct and distant. The ordinary orchestration of life continued, joined now by the calm certainty that they were entangled, not by scientific proof, but by daily acts of love and a stubborn fidelity to the presence that had come to them in a candlelit chapel and had, in time, stayed. They would catalog the 7 truths in many ways, on scrap paper pinned to notice boards, in the mouths of children who repeated them like nursery rhymes, in a small printed leaflet used for newcomers. But the truths lived in the small choices, hands that did not flinch, meals made without calculation, the presence of someone when the night grew too long. In these things Mary found her prayer answered, not always by removal of pain, but by the slow knitting of hearts. And so the village kept working, keeping watch, planting, forgiving, tending. If any who read of St. Augustine searched for proof that the phrase quantum entanglement itself had once opened the door, they would find instead a simpler evidence, people answering one another, a tree that had been planted with hands that remembered to return, and a library of small mercies stacked like bricks against the cold. For Mary, for James, for Clara, for Miriam, for Thomas, and for Ara, the miraculous was not an otherwise unreachable event, but the commonplace extraordinary, that small, persistent answer that comes when a community refuses to let someone fall alone. There were more seeds to plant and more evenings to keep. There were councils and spreadsheets to make room for warmth, and there were times when Mary would stand again in the chapel, hands clasped, and feel the same soft brightness that had first prompted her to borrow the strange phrase. She would never claim to have unraveled any great mystery. She only kept tending the knot, faithful to the 7 truths and to the village that had learned to be a single garment. The work continued, as work does, in small increments, and with a stubborn hope that was neither naive nor cynical. The sapling grew. James learned how to steady his hands around dough. Clara laughed. Miriam taught. Thomas carved. Ara watched and named, and reminded them all that sometimes the simplest observations, "This tree will know us," were the truest. They were bound, not by physics proven, but by prayers answered in companionship, by broth given without calculation, by the ordinary miraculous work of being neighbors. The phrase they borrowed helped them tell their story in a world hungry for connection. The substance of it was older: presence, mercy, and faith that shows up. There was still more to tell: other encounters, fresh doubts, plans for wider gatherings, and ways to sustain their shelter beyond the first winter. Lives would continue to bend and straighten, to falter and be steadied. The quiet work of entanglement would go on. When the first frost came, it laid itself across the village like a belief slowly taking hold, thin, bright, and impossible to deny when morning light found it. Mary stood before the sapling wrapped in burlap, her breath a small cloud, and thought of the hands that had planted it. Not all clean, not all steady, but all returned. James came up behind her carrying a thermos of something too hot for the cold, and for a moment they watched a street of small roofs hold the frost like a shared secret. "We'll need to make shifts," James said. He spoke of wood and fuel, of who could knock on doors to check on the old, of extra soup the kitchen could keep on the stove. His hands remembered the rhythm of dough and giving. His worry took the shape of lists. Clara arrived beside him with a basket of cloths and a tuck of preserves, her laughter a warm sound in a narrow, frozen morning. "I baked too much," she announced, "always an advantage if you like to feed the worried." That afternoon the chapel smelled of lemon and hot broth and candle wax. They unrolled maps. The village split into lanes and terraces, each lane matched to a household and a pair of volunteers. Ara, who had taken to naming small things in the garden as though they were people, read out names from a list in a voice that had learned to make plain things sound like ceremonies. "Rosa, 2 nights a week," Ara said. "The Hendersons are away until Thursday. Can someone take the Monday watch?" Miriam, who taught in the afternoons, crossed her arms, thinking of pupils and winter colds. Thomas, with his long, quiet patience, offered to stoke the stove at the shelter when night fell. They had organized without asking permission from any distant authority. They had only arranged themselves. There was a simplicity to it that made it feel possible. Shifts that staggered so no one was exhausted, kitchens that swapped recipes so there was variety, and a small fund kept in a tin beneath the chapel bench for medicines and coal. Money for them was a practical thing. It helped, but it never solved their older doubts. Those doubts came late in December, wrapped in a neat suit and a neutral smile. The man called himself Ivan and said he represented a foundation that funded community resilience projects. He had charts and a polite language that turned questions into boxes to be ticked. He listened, then asked whether St. Augustine would consider opening a branch elsewhere, whether their model could be scaled, whether their practices could be documented in a grant proposal he could take to a board. Mary felt the old tightness around her ribs. The idea of replication was seductive. More hands, more soup, more saplings. But it also smelled of something else, of the slow friction that occurs when the warmth of a kitchen is moved into an office with forms and reports. "We don't want to be turned into a program," she said. "We want people to learn to sit with one another." Ivan smiled in a way that admitted both things were true. You could have reach and you could have warmth, though often at the cost of one for the other. Replication, he said, doesn't mean losing the heart. It means teaching others how to keep their own. They argued in the chapel late into the night. Some, James among them, wanted the certainty money could buy.
He thought of the bakery's new oven, of steady wages for a few more months. Others, like Miriam, feared that measurements and benchmarks would make them change how they made decisions, from lived judgment to boxes on a checklist. Clara feared something different still, that their stories would be reduced to slogans on a flyer. Mary listened to them all. She felt the sapling's memory in her fingertips. She remembered a phrase borrowed like a talisman, and how it had opened a door but had never been the whole of what came through. "What if we teach them the least we can," she said finally, "so they have the confidence to keep the rest?" It was an answer halfway between yes and no, an attempt to make room. They wrote a plan that kept the core small, a weekend workshop for neighboring villages, where they would teach the practices they used: how to cook for illness, how to set up watches that didn't burn people out, how to begin conversations that were not rescue nor advice, but presence. Their leaflet would include the 7 truths, not as doctrine, but as prompts: how to arrive, how to listen, how to stay. Ivan left with a polite promise to return with numbers and a form. Mary and the others breathed as if they just exhaled for the first time in hours. Winter tightened. Rose's breathing grew shallow in a night of black wind and thin moons. She had been stout and loved for decades. Her illness was not dramatic, but persistent and ordinary. The community gathered in the way communities gather when they are small enough to matter, around a bed, with soup, with hands that knew how to make a pillow more comfortable.
Someone held Rose's hand as others made tea and told stories and hummed the parts of hymns that everyone knew. There was no miraculous cure. Rose's body surrendered to whatever it was meant to, but the room filled with a kind of careful presence that made the edges of fear less sharp. That night, after Rosa died, they held an impromptu vigil by the sapling. Clara lit a candle and put it at the tree's base. The flame made a small ring of gold on the snow. People stood, some of them awkwardly, unused to public grief, and spoke of Rosa as though she were a book they'd all read in different childhoods. James said something about how Rosa had always requested extra crusts. Thomas carved a small, simple box that would carry a few of Rosa's buttons to the chapel. Miriam tied a ribbon around it. Mary could not forget the exact hardness of Rosa's hands in life, and the way, in death, they seemed to melt into gentleness. The funeral brought neighbors who had not been part of the shelter before, people from across the valley who had heard, in fragments, of a village that kept vigil. Some came with food, some came because their own grief needed the company of another grief. In the days after, new faces lingered in the chapel doorway, not demanding instruction, but asking for warmth. A woman from 2 lanes over, whose name was Hazel, asked Mary if the safe practices could be shown to a small group in her building. "We're a lot of old people," she said. "We get fragile in winter." This was exactly the kind of invitation Mary feared and hoped for: small, unstructured, intimate. They agreed to go to Hazel's building once a week and show how to make broth that did not oversalt, how to listen without trying to fix, how to set a kettle close enough to carry a scent of cooking into an empty room. Mary found the visits restorative. They were not public relations, they were labor and love. As they expanded gently, so did their questions. Who could they include at the table? What if someone who had once harmed another asked to be sheltered? Where was the line between hospitality and enabling harm? These were not theoretical debates, but urgent, painful questions that pressed on old seams. A man named Paul, who had a past of addiction and had hurt a neighbor in the months before the shelter began, knocked at the chapel door on a gray afternoon, with eyes that had the small pleading of one who had nowhere else to go. The village was split on Paul. Some remembered nights when they'd found him sleeping by the river and had offered him a hand. Others remembered the neighbor's broken window and an old fear that had not yet healed. They held a council in the same way they'd done everything, by speaking plainly about the stories they carried and asking what each could live with. Mary insisted on a short trial, shelter, yes, but with agreed expectations, with a named person to check in, with accountability.
Paul, who had learned to lower his head and listen like a man who wanted to be remade, agreed. Weeks later, when the wind softened into a thaw, they found Paul carrying Thomas's carved benches from the chapel to the shelter, a quiet, steady labor. He had not become a different person overnight. He still had times when the old impulses pulled. But the village's watchfulness and insistence on presence, on saying what they needed and asking what they offered, had made a scaffold he could lean on without falling apart. Presence, it seemed, could be the margin that kept someone from tipping into old habits. The work of tending a village in winter is punctuated by small mundanities that feel like prayer. Trimming an overgrown hedge, fixing a leaking roof, teaching a child how to tie shoelaces. They learned how to fund these many small needs. James began a bread subscription. For a small price, families could reserve loaves to be delivered weekly, and the proceeds went into the chapel tin. Clara sold jars of marmalade. Miriam organized weekend lessons for teenagers in emergency first aid. The money was never enough to buy certainty, but it bought medicines and coal. In February, the village hosted the weekend workshop. People came from 3 neighboring towns, young women with jittery energy, a retired teacher with a slow, assured voice, a pair of teenagers who were more curious than they pretended to be. Mary taught them how to begin conversations that asked for story instead of answers. Miriam led a class on listening practices that did not rush to solution. James demonstrated how making bread for others could be both a service and an act of shared dignity. On the final night, they sat in the chapel by candlelight and spoke of failures as much as successes. One young man confessed that his project had collapsed because he tried to import every tool they'd used without learning the rhythm that had sustained it. "We thought it was the words," he said, "but it's the coming back. It's the way you make a mistake and someone still comes over with more broth." The young people left with small packets, recipes, lists of contacts, a folded copy of the 7 Truths nailed into a wooden token, things that could be reproduced. Ivan and his charts had asked for scale. They had brought scale, but not as a single line item. The work would continue to be messy and local. Spring approached with a softness that felt like a covenant. The sapling released its burlap and pushed tiny green fingers into a sky that had a different depth to it. The village planned a festival to mark the first year since the chapel doors had opened in that intentional way. They hung bunting that Clara made from old cloth, threaded with Thomas's carved beads, and set a table that could hold anyone who came hungry. The festival drew a crowd that was not only from their Hun streets. People who had been helped over the months came to stand, to speak, to bring potluck dishes. There were small arguments over music. Someone wanted a band, someone else wanted silence. Children ran in the margins, discovering the sapling's newness as though it were a living toy. Ara named a few of the younger branches, as if the newness should have human names too. At dusk, they lit candles and set them in jars along the path to the chapel. Mary stood near the sapling and listened to the village's murmur, the low hum of voices that had become a known frequency. Someone read a brief note of thanks. Another told a story of a winter night when a watch had prevented something worse. There was no triumphalism, no rhetoric of salvation. Instead, there was a patience that had learned to keep small fires lit. When the festival ended and people wandered away under a sky that had learned to hold stars again, Mary remained for a while by the sapling with James and a few others. They wrapped the tree in a neat circle of lights as a sign of guarding it for its first long season. "We didn't invent anything," James said. "We just remembered how to show up." Mary thought of the borrowed phrase that had been both a door and a danger. It had been useful as a seed of curiosity, a way to start conversations with people who might not have come otherwise. But what had rooted the work was not the cleverness of a metaphor. It was the choice to be present again and again, to make space for shame and confession, to keep watch even when the deeds were small and unclaimed by publicity. There were still plans to make. They would visit other villages, as they'd promised, and teach with humility. They needed a better way to keep the shelter's resources transparent to avoid squabbles. They had to think through the legalities Ivan had hinted at, without letting legal structure eclipse daily compassion. They had to continue asking hard questions: when to refuse, when to hold, when to demand change. Those questions would not yield a single answer. But in the quiet that followed the festival, under the soft sound of leaves reappearing on the sapling's thin arms, Mary felt the same steady brightness she had felt the first time she had borrowed that strange phrase in the chapel. It was not proof of anything, beyond the fact that people could, if they wished, refuse indifference. It was a willingness to be ordinary and extraordinary at once, to cook, to watch, to forgive. As spring moved into its fuller green, the village found itself with new problems as well as new resources. A developer planning a row of townhouses proposed to purchase a disused lot at the edge of the village. A small group argued that the lot could be used for a communal garden, and another insisted on selling to secure funds for the shelter. They navigated these choices with the same care they had used before: conversations, slow votes, and a willingness to change minds. In the end, they kept the land and planted it, its soil turned by hands that had learned to serve more than themselves.
Mari continued to tend the chapel and to host the small groups that sought instruction on how to keep someone through a winter, how to hold confession without humiliation, how to make a meal that warmed both body and will. Sometimes it was all she could do to keep on, days when questions felt too heavy, when the list of needs outpaced their modest resources. On those nights she would go sit by the sapling and press her palm to its bark. It was a small ritual. It was also a promise. There were more seeds in pockets, more evenings to keep. The village had learned to carry its work close and to hand it on lightly when asked. They were not a model to be exported without attention. They were a practice that required presence. Mary could not have predicted how many hands would come to help, nor how many nights would be spent worrying about a roof or a child's fever. But she had the hard comfort of seeing that, when people keep showing up, the slow architecture of grace does build itself, brick by brick, sometimes brittle, sometimes splendid, always human. And so they kept their watch, planting, forgiving, learning again and again that the miracle most worth guarding was not the phrase that had opened their doors, but the daily insistence that they would not let someone fall alone. The sapling grew, the jars of marmalade dwindled and were replenished, the nights of vigil passed and returned, and Mary, with the faint give of life still under her thumb, continued to press her hand against something that had become, in its small way, proof enough.